Thanks very much for inviting us here. We're really delighted, if we're slightly scared to be here. And we're going to try and talk around three things. We're going to try and talk about ourselves, but in terms of constructing class and intersectionality. Then we're going to turn to higher education inequalities and class experience, and then we're going to try and bring it all together. And I'm Meg, and that's Lisa. And in this book, which is just so lovely to celebrate, thank you for inviting me to be part of it. In 1997, I contributed a chapter to the book, and it's called Missing Links, Working Class Women of Irish Descent. And I started the chapter by saying that I was intrigued by the way in which class operates as an unstable category, a diffraction, if you like, in the lives of women of working class backgrounds who work in higher education, and I still am. We may be middle class in occupational status terms, we may align ourselves with working class politics, we may feel working class in our hearts and minds. And I think sometimes this ambiguity that others have talked about this morning can have high emotional costs of trying to fit, never fitting, never wanting to fit, trying to feel inside, feeling outside in our workplaces. And I also wanted to talk about another dimension of my identity, which is the relative invisibility of women of Irish descent, and the way in which class, culture and faith operate in complex ways and in different times to shape our social world. And I also wanted to problematise the academy, its unevenness and its internal contradictions, and I still want to. I also wrote about the concern to move away from any essentialising constructions of women and argued for the recognition of difference. But I also wrote then, and I think it's important to restate now, that there are conditions of our lives which bind us together as women in the academy. Even if we're professors, we are marginalised, we are positioned as other, we are rendered invisible, we are systematically discriminated against in terms of pay and promotion, and we still are. So, this has been widely circulated, most of you will be aware of this. In 2015-16, universities used a spine post, and more women than men were up to 0.43, but at that situation it reverses. And at the highest points, almost 2/3 of academic staff were men, while just 37% were women. I remember when I first went to King's College, we got a magazine, an internal magazine, and it said, it had a triumphant cover that 9% of women, of professors at King's were women, so we were beating the national average, which was 4%, and they were actually congratulating themselves. Yes, it's changed a bit, because now the survey is reporting that, yes, the gap between male and female professors is smaller than it used to be, but it's still there, and it's quite marked. And when we go down onto lower grades, we see that the disparity between salaries is enormous. And we are actually doing equal work of equal value. And so it's quite interesting, because I remind us all, do we remember when the Equal Pay Act was passed? Yes. What year? 1970. And the Amendment Act? 2010. And we're still in this position. So there is a point at which, talking about working class women, there is a point where it was something that somebody said this morning, reaching out. In a sense, women in the academy are all positioned in particular ways, and pay and promotion are really quite powerful. However, in the chapter, I was talking about space and place and being working class Irish in London. And so in this first section, Lisa and I are talking about the role that space, place have played, play in the construction of our class identity. And for me, it's very much bound up with what I wrote about in 1997, an Irish Catholic childhood, albeit in central London. So I was brought up in an environment where there were clear boundaries about what to believe, how to behave, what to think. And in some ways it was repressive, controlling and fearful. But in other ways it opened up a rich inner world of legend, mystery and myth, and rich language and music. So it was a very complex experience. It also provided a bulwark against all the pain and exclusions of poverty and class in 1950s London, particularly for my mum bringing us up in London. Being part of a Catholic faith community gave her solidarity, and it was very, very important. And I've got written here, strength and a sense of solidarity. And in a sense, we were all in it together where I lived and grew up. And we desperately wanted council flats, but migrants in those days didn't get them. It was post-war and we all lived next to bomb sites. People would have killed for a council flat to have been on a council estate, but it just wasn't possible in London at that time. Growing up in London and going to secondary school in the 1960s was a massive time of disruption and challenges to older ways of thinking. And so I was exposed to a range of counter-hegemonic discourses, from literature, the media, music, that rendered unstable and interrupted and disrupted the old settled class cultures, the old settled stories. And what I was caught up in then and now was a complex hybridity of clashing values, immediately evident in massive rows within my family about history, about activism, particularly about CND at that time, as well as a feeling that you could remake yourself. It felt somehow as if there was a possibility, certainly in London. And I was going to write about flaneurs, but I decided not to, because I wasn't one. But there was high employment, and that was really important. There really was high employment, and there was a very powerful and influential youth culture, music, a heady time of fighting back against oppression. And here I'm thinking of the anti-Vietnam War movement, as well as the start of second wave feminism. You know, it was a heady time to be alive. And yet there were fixed costs, fixed places, fixed costs of school, where, to echo Mary Evans, quote, the emotional costs of being plunged into a middle-class world was doubtly considerable, but equally significant was the capital outlay necessary for this new educational experience. So relatives buying school uniforms, the sorts of things that people detailed this morning. So poverty and lack were a break to what could be done, experienced or accessed. And then college, and I'll come to that later. But all the time, as well as being of Irish working class heritage, I was also female and white. And these aspects of my identity make for a more complicated account, where advantage and disadvantage become intertwined. And this is where, and it's ever so old, but Peggy McIntosh's work. Oh, yeah, you know, I mean, 1988, she said it all. And in 1988, she drew up a list of white privileges that she, as she put it, in my case, attached to somewhat more than skin colour privilege than to class, religion, ethnic status or geographical location. Though of course all these other factors are intertwined. And she wrote down a long list of these, and I've only got time to give you a flavour of what she wrote. And she said, as far as I can tell, my African American co-workers, friends and acquaintances with whom I come into daily or frequent contact in this time, space and place of work, cannot count on these conditions. And she gave a list of examples, and she said, I can be pretty sure that my children's teachers and employers will tolerate them if they fit school and workplace norms. My chief worries about them don't concern others' attitudes towards their race. And she said, and it's very powerful, and it still obtains today, I can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having my co-workers on the job suspect that I got it because of my race. So Lisa and I, when we've had this discussion, we're aware of being very much working class women growing up in particular places, and that has shaped us and shapes us. But we're also aware that contradictorily we experience white privilege, and that has to be recognised as people have said. So when Lisa and I talk about class and space and place, we acknowledge the privilege, lack, othering complexities involved in our day-to-day realisation of our situated identities. Over to you.
So obviously Meg's chapter was very heavily shaped by where she came from, and so I want to sort of contextualise my own background a little bit and locate it in a time, space and a place. I was born and bred in Hull, and both my parents were born and bred in Hull, and both sets of grandparents were born and bred in Hull, so I've got a long pedigree in Hull. Hull, or Kingston upon Hull as it's properly known, is to most people a little bit odd. It's geographically isolated in the way most cities are not, surrounded by the Humber estuary to the south and a large, sparsely populated and relatively affluent rural area, the East Riding, to the north, east and west. For as long as I recall, Hull has been a shorthand for not very good. Hell. It goes well in hell, as we hear. It was the poorest city in England, bottom at some point of every league table you can bear to mention, except being voted the first and infamous crap town in that well-respected reputable publication that I cannot see. We're also very good at being self-deprecating, and it's probably a rational defence strategy, I suspect. If you tell people how rubbish you are, they might tire of saying it again. Unfortunately, they don't, and Julie's still always told how crap you are. But still, how can it not begin to shape the way that children and young people in such areas are viewed and importantly come to view themselves? The issue is, Hull does often come near the bottom of these league tables, but the story is told abstracted from any historical, social and political context. So I'm probably going to boil a little bit of a history lesson here, but I think it's quite important. So they're often devoid of any understanding of place. Hull is a tightly bound unitary authority with no suburbs to really call its own. It's still little known outside of Hull. It was the most bombed city outside of London in World War II. 95% of its buildings were damaged, many destroyed, and over half of the city centre wiped out in one go. My own nana, my mother's mother, had her house completely destroyed not once but 3 times during the Second World War. A busy strategic port at the time meant Hull was an important military target for Luftwaffe, and its physical location on the edge of the Humber and up the river from the North Sea marked it out as an easy target. I'd say we're possibly asked an easy target, but in a different way. So important was its significance that reports of damage to Hull was rarely explicitly named, and instead it was referred to as a northern coastal town. And just to be clear, Hull is a city, not a town, and it's not coastal. Something it is coastal. It was therefore largely rebuilt from the late 1940s and 1950s onwards, and what emerged from that was a huge council estate building programme, and this was to shape modern Hull. That is a lot of the way Hull is constituted. Therefore, comparing Hull to many other authorities and cities do not compare like for like, and is abstracted from the uniqueness of place and its resulting space. I would argue, therefore, that Hull has a predominantly working class population. It is largely a working class city. It is also a very white city, although this has diversified somewhat in the past 20 years. So, back to my own upbringing in Hull, and I truly see myself in a different way to the people who spoke earlier on. As a child of the 80s, I grew up in a country gripped by conservative rule at the height of individualism, and the Conservative power had taken power just before I turned 2 in 1979, and had only been voted out of office when I was 20, so it shaped my whole life. I myself lived on the same council estate in Hull. That is actually my street. I found it on Google Images. I was really So I grew up on the same council estate in Hull my whole early life, living with my parents and my older sister first in a 2-bedroom masonette, and then when we outgrew the space, we were offered a council exchange into a 3-bedroom house. And Mum always talks about the disgusting house and how she had to clean it for 3 weeks. In my early life, my father always worked, and although there'd been a period in the 1970s where he had struggled to find work, he worked as a chemical process operative at BP Chemicals from my being born until he retired due to ill health in the 1990s. He was also a union shop steward there. Prior to his work here, my father had a number of other jobs, including being a milkman, a bus conductor and a bus driver. We were working class, but we certainly never saw ourselves as poor. We had a car, we went on UK-based holidays most years, which lots of my peers at school never had.
To Blackpool.
Often to Blackpool, I had a relative there, yes. And my parents were actually one of many who bought the council house in the 1980s, so my dad insists that it was actually a really rational option to do because the rent charges at the time made it that the mortgage repayments, at least initially, were lower than rent charges. So I was generally part of, or at least on the boundaries of what many will recognise as being or call the respectable working class. My maternal grandfather had been a docker, and my maternal grandfather had always worked in the railways like his father before him, and both my grandmothers employed in domestic and ancillary work. Not to forget my own mother, because sometimes we do forget to talk about our mothers, and I think Diane's mentioned that in another way, who worked part-time at Asda for 29 years, only leaving in 2015 to take up a new role as my prime babysitter, my twins, when I returned to work after maternity leave. So just to talk a little bit about my own education and how I got here, really. And I attended the schools initially on the estate where I grew up until my father, worried about the crowd, as we call them, that I'd got in with, declared he wanted me off the estate before I was either, I love this phrase, before I was either knocked up or locked up, as he put it. So I was sent to the school 3 miles down the road, and this wasn't an academic decision, this was a decision to sort of change where my dad was worried my life might be headed. And in fact, the school I attended, and I left in 1993, less than 7% of us at that time gained 5 or more GCSEs. And the school's actually since closed down, and once special measures emerged, my school was in and out of it until it closed down in 2010. So despite this, I still remember remarks from teachers at school, because I wasn't, shall we say, diligent and I was quite loud and maybe free-spirited. I was actually told on more than one occasion that I'd never amount to anything, and that a boyfriend who started going out when I was 15 was actually asked by one teacher, "What earth do you see in a girl like Lisa Jones?" This relationship was actually an important turning point, because up until this point I never assumed I would do anything other than leave school and find work, because that's what everyone else in my family had done. Nobody had ever attended university, but this boyfriend's brother was about to go to university, and so after my initial disbelief that anybody would willingly choose to stay on at school, I was sold the idea of getting away, seeing the world, well, another city at least, and studying just the bits I liked. What was there to like about it? This was not without hurdles, included filling in my sixth form application form and being told by a teacher that I was being overly ambitious to put A-levels down, and that perhaps I should swap it over and put GCSE resits. And then another major hurdle was to convince my dad at the time, because he thought I was simply trying to be lazy and avoiding getting a job. It doesn't feel like that now, but it was quite a big hurdle. So the reason I've talked about this is that I'm sure that this seemingly chance encounter of going out with somebody who lived away from the estate where I lived, whose brother was going to university, seemingly changed my life. And I think if maybe I've not gone to school off the estate, that might not have happened. And incidentally, it also changed my sister's life. Now, my sister's 5 years older than me, but on not me going to university, the following year she was like, well, if you can do it, I can do it. And my sister then went to university, and she moved down to London to study, where she stayed for 20 years. So it's interesting that in recent years, both of us have moved back to Hull, and our ties to our family and possibly our city particularly strong. And again, I'd argue that might have something to do with our class. So my final point on this is that the evidence on education is overwhelming. As we've all seen here, working class kids just don't get on and do as well as their middle class counterparts. But what evidence is also demonstrated is that working class kids in places like Hull, post-industrial, struggling places, often northern places, coastal towns, urban spill areas, are not doing as well as some of their counterparts in inner city places like London and Manchester. It's therefore hard to suggest that place and space are not significant shaping factors in relation to social class. But it's complicated, and I think more definitely needs to be done to understand that dynamic further, because I'm not sure that I even can start to have the answers to it.
We're moving on to our second point, which is about higher education inequalities. And I'm going back to what I wrote in the book. And my choice of career wasn't very surprising. It was almost inevitable. For a working class girl, becoming a primary school teacher was a step up. It's part of the historic class mobility and dislocation account that stretches back to the 19th century. I was the first in my family to go to higher education, never mind that it was a gendered choice, primary school teaching, or that my route was class specific, teacher training and not university. So when I went to college, I think 10% of the population went to university. It was a minority experience. No one gave me any careers advice. My parents weren't aware of any possibilities. They saw me as a great success. I was going to be a primary school teacher, and I was a great success. And I think, though, the point is that, as Zmroczek says, I think that there are certain cultural scripts about suitable jobs for women in a given time and place. And I think she's right that let's take women out. Of course, it still works, but let's put working class the working classes in. And I think there are cultural scripts about suitable jobs, and Lisa's told us about the script that was offered to her, that because she met somebody, a serendipity, a different agenda. And I think this question of classed and gendered scripts applies now, but in different ways. There weren't many working class people at my London day college, and I had to stay near home to support my mum, who was really quite ill. And there were all sorts of hidden and not hidden injuries of class. And what I do remember, I had a sociology lecturer, and she was laughing, it was like a casual note, I can't remember, and she said to us all, she said, "Oh, my divine children, they've nicknamed the cleaner Hoover." And my mum was a cleaner, and I thought, God, if somebody called my mum Hoover, you know what I mean? And we were supposed to go, oh, how jolly. And I sort of felt, and I felt ashamed, and I feel ashamed now, that I was enraged, and I'm enraged by the person I was then that sat there and said nothing. So I worked in London primary schools for a considerable time, and I was encouraged to apply for a job in higher education. But it was teaching people who were going to be teachers. It wasn't to move into the academy. It's a bit like Diane said this morning. My generation often moved later, and we moved in particular places. So going into higher education was more of the same, like being in a primary school for me. We were called educationalists, and the people in the other departments were called academics. So, you know, and we just did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of teaching, marking, visiting schools. But we were expected to have a master's, but that was all. We weren't expected to go to conferences or write papers or anything. And so moving to a post where I was expected to behave as an academic came at a later time for me, and was directly related because I had that primary experience, that's how I got the job. But I got a degree in urban education and a degree of luck in getting the job. And institutions have different histories and cultures, as I think we heard this morning, and they're influenced by their location, place is important, and their intake. And in an old London university, the expectations may be, you know, publications and research are more important than teaching, never mind the rhetoric about the TEF. But there are different oppressions, opportunities, silences and voices. Rarely is the talk of class identity, and many of my colleagues come, or seem to come, to me from middle-class backgrounds, more than when I worked in the teacher training college, where it was actually a Catholic college, and I felt more, because of my faith perspective, I could read the culture, and I didn't always agree with it, but I felt I knew what I was dealing with. Whereas at the academic setting, it was a very different ballgame. And the processes, again, of being and doing academia can involve complicated psychic costs of trying to empower students while not being very powerful yourself, of trying to widen student participation in a setting where academic jobs are increasingly disappearing or being casualised, where there is still massive underrepresentation of BAME colleagues, and where white privilege still seems to walk unchecked. So in terms of space and place issues, what Lisa and I want to get considered in any talks about social class and higher education are 3 points. Space and place are critical. There's a hierarchy in the UK Academy, but there are internal hierarchies too. So it might be really high status to work at King's College London, an older elite university, but patterns of privilege, the capacity to undertake research, even to come to a day like this, or go to conferences in exotic parts of the world, are not shared out evenly. It's complicated. So, working part-time as a part-time tutor on a rolling contract on the PGCE in a very elite old university may not seem that much of a privilege. Place matters in other ways as well. Being a younger academic in a new university may offer very little advantage. Being a young academic in an old university may offer very little advantage either, because of casualisation and because of having to say yes to everything to look keen and good and maybe get a job one day. In class terms, different institutions will have different class cultures, shaped in part by their student intakes as well as by their location, and this will impact the working lives of academics in these institutions. We may feel more like a fish in water in some places rather than others if we have a working class background ourselves. That's how we may feel, but then there may well be dislocations between how we feel and how we're seen by our students.
So I think more or less all of us have had the same message, that higher education is by and large really clear middle class space. And like other people here, like my first encounter with higher education as an undergraduate was not a comfortable experience. The feeling that somehow he was being somewhere and a place in space that people like me didn't really belong. And that's followed me, but yet it's a strange contradiction because equally I feel at home there professionally, so I've worked for a very long time now. And to a large extent, these feelings of not quite fitting, I've become quite good at hiding, like lots of people have. And I was really, really pleased to be asked to do this because reading Class Matters when I first started my doctoral studies was really influential to me. It made it feel like it was okay to be somebody like me in academia. But just when I feel like I've got used to the rules of the game, I'm reminded that I don't know the rules as well as I thought I did, and I expose my naivety and show myself up to be what I am, someone not fully familiar with these rules and a bit out of my depths. There are some rules from some universities that are universal, some rules that are universal, and some that are particular depending on where you work and what role you do, as Meg has just talked about. So I was employed in academia for the first 8 years as a researcher at Russell Group University on fixed-term research contracts. Like lots of people will know this trajectory here. In a time of, I suppose, relative plenty in terms of being a researcher. In the 2000s, there was lot more research money around than there is. And whilst I knew the personal and financial insecurities attached to moving from one contract to the next, I was doing my PhD, I enjoyed my work, I was working with like-minded people, and moving from contract to contract at the time was relatively easy. And so the landscape changed somewhat in 2010. I don't think I'm underselling that shift. The project I was working on, which was a 4-year project, which is a really good secure contract as a researcher, was ended prematurely with the change in government. And I'd just completed my doctoral studies. I'd also moved and relocated physically 120 miles back to Hull, where I'm from. So I knew my next step was to attempt to get a permanent lecturing post to try and get security that way. And lots of people in here have echoed that idea of that position to be in. And it also meant therefore moving an institution where I wasn't known and where I didn't know anybody. And I admit I certainly didn't even anticipate that the rules might even be slightly different in a different institution. Again, showing my naivety and my rookie experience of being in a middle class space. And in short, I would argue that this probably delayed me in securing a post. I assumed some things spoke for themselves in interviews and therefore didn't talk about them, and other things I spent far too much time talking about. Made lots of assumptions and made lots of errors. In one interview, I was asked with a knowing smile about my time working in a department store. I had put this on the application form, and I didn't realise the rules of the game in academia meant I could be a bit more picky about what experience I talked about. I'd exposed myself to what I was, a working class girl who nearly didn't end up being there. I'm not really sure that the interviewers really cared either, that I could empathise and support students from working class backgrounds. Feedback once told me, you didn't really sell yourself. As we've talked about here, this idea of networking things is sometimes quite a difficult thing to do from a working class background, where the very idea of selling yourself infers something like completely bragging, being up yourself, being the big I am. I'm not sure these are the concerns that middle class applicants feel in quite the same ways. Moving on to the current landscape in higher education, it seems as though we've been talking about the instability of higher education for well over 20 years since the publication of Class Matters. And unfortunately, it's not changed. As we've already alluded to here, the landscape is very different. Fees, rent, TEF, and the pace and level of change is driven by policy directives is intensifying, not slowing. And universities across the country are watching, reinforcing and re-evaluating in some cases how to play a changing game. An issue that arises here is around class and around access, both in terms of students and in terms of staff from diverse backgrounds. Class, as we've seen, continues as an invisible presence, and it's interesting that lots of people talk about class in that way. As we all know, league tables are almost always decontextualised. In the wake of anticipated changes to REF, it's likely we'll see more staff being moved on to TNS contracts, as we've already talked about earlier today. And we might anticipate that this is likely to affect some people more than others, potentially women and those who might not be well versed in how to play the game of academia. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. It's also like that issues of advantage and disadvantage around classes discourses will continue talking about the disadvantage as being working class people and how do we get them to get on in this system rather than challenging the system itself. And I think that was the point that came up earlier on, rather than turning our focus to the system of privilege itself. But we'll come back to that. Being working class female in the academy has added issues too. It took me so long to be socialised into the academy. It doesn't really help when you then take time out to have a family. As I found after 15-month absence from having twins and returning, I feel that I had to be re-socialised again and start at the bottom again, picking up those jobs that other people have moved on from and trying to sort of reset yourselves. As we know, the division of labour is not always distributed evenly, and women more often than not are disproportionately involved in the pastoral and student-facing aspects that fit with their associated status in society as caring and motherly in some way, leaving them less time to focus on activities such as the production of ref outputs that enable us to get on. And finally, in teaching, we are likely to be met with varying levels of resistance and recognition when we're teaching our students about class. So I've taught in rooms where the very mention of class and how middle class advantage works is met with eye rolling at best and outright absolute hostility and denial of that, to rooms where I see people nodding enthusiastically and recognising what I'm saying has some resonance with their own reactions. And Meg and I have talked about this in our conversations leading up to our talk today. So any classroom in the academy can have students with these opposing reactions, but in all likelihood this will vary from institution to institution, but also subject to subject. I know in Hull, for instance, the student population is much more diverse in education where I work, and to some of the more classical subjects in university. But I don't think it's too much to suggest that the more elite the institution, the closer you get to the classics within institutions, the student populace is less likely to be sympathetic to some of the views that we've talked about in this room today. So we've talked about our own background, and we've talked about being class in relation to the academy, and then Meg's given me the task of closing it. So I'm hoping to try to do justice to our talk. If that's okay. So we really wanted to sort of finish with three key things then, three key themes. Firstly, which I thought was picked up really strongly by all the contributions in Class Matters, is that our class identities as working class female academics is subject to debate often with other people. The status conferred on us by our engagement in academia is still often seen as contradictory to our own subjectivities and how we still identify in some way, shape or form as working class. I have over the years had to defend my working classness on multiple occasions, and I'm sure lots of people have in this room. And it's the point being that higher education is a middle class space, and the very act that we're here therefore means that we are middle class too. And as Meg and Diane and others have written about elsewhere, working class people who have succeeded somehow, so for instance in relation to being educationally successful, are examples that the system we have works. We don't need to fix it because we're all used as examples that social mobility is alive and well. It is said, well, you're middle class now, as if the connections we have to our working class backgrounds has somehow gone away and is finished with, but that's because I have this particular view of social mobility. Whilst I know why I feel I'm working class and have what I call a pretty good grasp of the literature, and we talked about this in class theory around it, it's still not the easiest conversation to have with unsympathetic colleagues or individuals who maybe don't have access or are interested in the same body of work that we do. Such eyebrow raising, when you say that you're working class still, often means that I very, very frequently decide not to enter into those debates now, because I'm still not convinced I've managed to convince a single person in any of those debates that I am working class, or that their views on working class are not shared by anybody else. Ultimately, it's about loyalties and where and who we stand with, as Meg and I discussed during one of our conversations. And I don't think it's a surprise that many of us in this room have committed ourselves to talking and working around social class injustices, and I think it really picks up the points that we were talking about in the second conversation about what we should do about it. Okay. So the second point resurfaces and builds on the point I made earlier on, that as academics from working class backgrounds we never fully feel at home in the academy, and the feelings of insecurity and inferiority that Kim Clancy and Louise highlighted in their chapters of Class Matters never really leaves us. The last point that we want to finish on, one of the things that was really important when we talked about our class identities was that we still often feel that we have to look up words. we both spent quite a long time laughing about this. Like, we run away and consult dictionaries because we hear a word that we maybe don't know what it means, or reading it and we want to look it up, or we know what a word means but we've never heard it said out loud, so we go and try to work out how to practice our pronunciation. And we reach the conclusion that this possibly happens to middle class academics too, but we're not sure they agonise and think that it shows that they're inferior in the same way that it does for us, and that's something that we found quite powerful. We've tried out lots of words that over the years we've looked up. So just then we move into our last point then about privilege, and it goes back to Meg's earlier point that was raised by Mackintosh, and Kimmel has also talked about this in his work. And I think it's a really powerful way of seeing it, is that privilege is invisible to those who have it. This is the way privilege works. So building on Mackintosh's point, Kimmel argues in both his preface to his edited work on privilege from 2014 and also in a really entertaining TED Talk, which is accessible quite easily on the same issue. He talks to his audience and says, "I stand before you as a middle-class white man, but I haven't always been a middle-class white man. Let me tell you the story of when I became a middle-class white man." And he then tells the audience a really powerful story about how his privilege was revealed to him through hearing a conversation between two of his female colleagues, one white and one black, in a graduate reading group he was part of 30 years ago when he himself was a graduate student. He outlines that before seeing this exchange, he'd never realised the way that being middle class gave him a privilege, that being white gave him a privilege, or being a man gave him a privilege. Before that, he said he looked in the mirror and saw a human being. And this is a really powerful way of revealing privilege. And Kimmel says that, that the study of gender is often seen as the study of women. The study of class is seen about the study of the working class. And the study of ethnicity is the study of people who are not white. And in that way, he said this is a really dangerous view because the practices of the privileged are rarely questioned and they're left unchecked. He also says this is powerful. This is a powerful message for most of us working academics, especially when writing about class and inequalities, because we're likely that our work, it's likely that our work and our in academia, in terms of publications, in terms of our performance in universities, may well be being judged by people who are not aware of at best their own privilege. This is particularly evident, for instance, even amongst the seasoned amongst us, as well as unknown early career researchers, when we submit our articles to journals. And it might be evidence in some of the hostility that you read in terms of work on class and class advantage. So it also takes us back to our earlier point, our first point about intersectionality. I wanted to finish on that really, which is that I think I had a chat with someone earlier on who was also talking about this, and it's this idea that as academics we're striving to find out what unites us, but also what differentiates us. It's a question of what is the same but different. And therefore, I think one of the closing points to mention really is that we should all be mindful of what privileges we might still have that might still be invisible to us ourselves.